Welcome back to A Secret History of Brands, the dark and twisted beginnings of the brand names we know and love. And perhaps after some of these revelations, might be time for reconsideration. Chapter 2, Hugo Boss, Nazi Fashion. There were many manufacturers involved in the uniforming and arming of the German Nazi soldiers throughout the Second World War, but only one of those companies would become a household name in fashion that remains in the public eye today, and that is Hugo Boss. The Hugo Boss Company features a namesake that is shrouded in disgrace and subversion, with accusations of forced labor and an allegiance to the National Socialist Party by Boss himself. There is no doubt that Hugo F. Boss agreed with and supported the ideals of the Nazi Party, and his clothing company would be one of many that ended up making uniforms for the Nazi troops and the Gestapo prior to and throughout the Second World War. Hugo Boss' early life. Hugo Ferdinand Boss was born on 8 July 1885 in the Swabian town of Metzingen in the Kingdom of Württemberg, Germany. Boss was the youngest of four siblings. His parents, Heinrich and Louise Boss, ran a modest lingerie shop, which Boss would eventually inherit when he married Anna Catherine Freisinger in 1908. It would be abnormal for the youngest child to inherit the family business under normal circumstances, but only Hugo and his sister survived infancy. Therefore, the then traditional responsibility was bestowed upon Hugo. The couple would have one daughter before Hugo enlisted in the German army in 1914 at the start of the First World War. Hugo never received any medals or promotions while serving in the army. Clearly, not ambitious about an ongoing military career. This isn't surprising for someone who had a family business to fall back on. The beginnings of a business. In 1924, a decade after enlisting in the military, Hugo F. Boss opened his very first clothing factory in his hometown of Metzingen. The startup required financial support from two local manufacturers, but soon the company was employing 20 to 30 seamstresses. The connection with the Nazis began early, when one of the first major commissions in his first year of business included the now notorious brown shirts for the National Socialist Party. The ripple effect caused by Black Tuesday in America would change the course of the story of Hugo F. Boss, leading him right into the center of the Nazis. The stock market on Wall Street crashed on 24 October 1929, driving the United States into the Great Depression, causing rampant unemployment and shattering America's economy. The effect of this crash was also felt around the world, and in Germany, unemployment began to rise as the economy continued to suffer. The textile manufacturers were hit hard, and by 1931, Hugo Boss was facing certain bankruptcy. Boss would make a deal with his creditors that allowed him to continue production, but clearly things weren't going in a good direction for Germany, and something needed to be done. This series of events led Hugo F. Boss right to the door of the National Socialist Party, of which he became a literal card carrying member in 1931, 2 years before Adolf Hitler would seize power of Germany. The party was promising economic solutions for Germany, including ways to help the unemployment levels that were plaguing the country. The Third Reich gave a good amount of business to Boss once he became an official party member. This came with restrictions, of course, because what they primarily wanted producing were uniforms and work clothing. But despite this, sales began to grow steadily from 1933 to 1938. Then, in 1938, the big commissions for Nazi uniforms began to flood in. Boss and his workers were thrilled with the influx, feeling that they had finally made it. Boss would peak in profits around 1942, but that is where it would level out because the Third Reich put a cap on the cost that manufacturers could charge in an effort to manage their own finances. The Boss factory was a price category 1, which essentially meant that they had the ability to produce the uniforms that the Nazis needed at the lowest prices possible. Not great news for Hugo Boss, and his company wouldn't develop into a huge corporation until long after his own death. Prior to the war, Boss had produced everything from the early brown shirts to black uniforms for the SS and the Hitler Youth uniforms. During the war, the Boss factory produced uniforms primarily for the German armed forces and Waffen SS. The examination of the Hugo Boss Company's role in producing Nazi uniforms may be highlighted in this book, but they were far from the only manufacturer contributing to the cause. Boss was in no way a standout in terms of production quantities or contributions. They were simply one of many in a vast country working as cogs in the Nazi machine. The fact that Hugo Boss is still a household name in high fashion today, despite the dark beginnings, is what makes it of such interest. It should be noted that while they produced uniforms for the Nazis, there is no reason to assume that Hugo Boss had anything to do with the design of any uniforms. Forced labor. The textile manufacturing trade in Nazi Germany wasn't exactly the highest paid job that a worker could have. The uniforms were certainly a necessary part of the German war machine, but the serious workforce moved towards more lucrative trades, mostly involving weaponry and engineering. There was, therefore, a distinct lack of available and skilled workers for the textile industry. Enter one of the darker parts of the affiliation of Hugo F. Boss with the Nazis: forced labor. The Hugo Boss Company first employed forced labor in April of 1940. The entire town of Metzingen would come to house a whopping 1,241 forced laborers during the war. There was a point when up to 180 of those workers were being made to work for Hugo Boss. This consisted of 140 forced laborers and 40 French prisoners of war. The majority of the forced workers were transplanted from Bielsko in Poland because there was already a large textile manufacturing industry there, so the skilled workforce was already trained and ready to go. The Nazi Gestapo brought the workers in to be divided amongst the various textile manufacturers throughout Metzingen. When the workers arrived in Metzingen, they were split up by gender. The women were placed with local families, while the men were moved into sheds in a dedicated Hugo Boss Company encampment. Investigations into the male workers' camp found that it was at least hygienic, but in 1943, a new camp was built to house all of the workers from the various Metzingen factories. The conditions at this camp were unstable at best, with food sometimes being scarce and the hygiene not to the standards of the previous accommodations. There is some evidence to suggest that Hugo F. Boss took certain measures to help the laborers receive treatment that was at least moderate, providing midday meals to them in the company canteen and trying to keep the female workers out of the camps. These measures were certainly a step in the right direction, but when you're dealing with the topic of slavery, it's all details.